Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Justinian and Theodora Part 4, Vanquishing the Vandals by Extra History. So, last episode, we saw one of the darkest moments of Justinian's career, the Nika Revolts. In this episode, I believe we get to see Belisarius heading west to reconquer some of that old Roman territory. Now, before we get into that, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
As smoke drifted over the city, there was a silence in Constantinople. The sort of silence that can only come after riot and clangor and death. Large swaths of the city had been burnt to the ground. People wandered the streets, looking for lost loved ones or picking through the wreckage for smoke-blackened belongings. But as Justinian looked out from his palace, over the guards repairing the gate, over the soldiers taking bodies from the hippodrome, he knew a new and greater Constantinople would rise from these ashes, and with it a new and greater Rome.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a brutal time for the city of Constantinople, right? This was, I mean, sure, it was sort of a personal triumph for Justinian, but it wasn't a very triumphant time. He had proved his rule, but he had proved it through bloody and brutal means. Not a great moment. But, I guess if you want to take a silver lining, at least for him, this was an opportunity, right? It had proved an opportunity to cement his rule, which he had done, and it was also an opportunity to rebuild the city. I mean, a good chunk of Constantinople had been burned down, destroyed, looted, and Justinian would seize that opportunity, and he would build back, greater than before. So, like I said, not like this was a great moment, but it did present some type of potential for the future, as much as I think a lot of people wouldn't have been willing to hear that in the moment, but of course Justinian, always ambitious, always looking ahead.
39 days after the riots, 39 days after the fire and the chaos, the first bricks were set on what would stand for 1,000 years as the greatest Christian church in the world. Where the old Hagia Sophia had collapsed and been gutted by flames just a few scant weeks earlier, a church 100 times more magnificent began to rise. Treasure from all over the empire flowed into the capital to adorn its walls and to pay its workers. The city as a whole united to reconstruct what they had destroyed. And as the walls of the Hagia Sophia began to rise, Justinian set his mind to his last great project.
Yeah, the Hagia Sophia, we talked about that in prior episodes. One of Justinian's greatest accomplishments was the construction of this church. It was truly monumental, one of the greatest feats of Byzantine architecture, famous for miles around. Pilgrims, Christian, and, not just Christian, but people would come to visit from a long way away and be very impressed by the grandeur of it, and particularly Christian pilgrims would usually be, moved by it. It was this amazing feat of architecture, this incredible church that it would take, a long time to beat its grandeur and impressiveness. Because, Justinian had these resources at hand. It would be a while before any Christian empire had those types of resources on hand to build something so monumental, right? So this stood for a long time as this amazing monument, this amazing piece of architecture. And that's one of the things that, Justinian saw an opportunity after the Nika Revolt. And that was one of the things, the most famous of the things that he did manage to build. Of course, it took a while to build, but it was very impressive.
The reconquest of what had been lost in the West. He was the emperor of Rome, not merely Greece or Anatolia. A bare 60 years ago, the West had fallen. There were still men who lived in the empire who remembered when Rome stretched from Asia to the far coasts of Gaul.
Right, and we talked about this before. At this moment, we are still sort of, if you look at the timeline of, say, the Eastern Roman Empire following the split of the West, we are still very early in that timeline. There are people who still remember when Rome held a lot of that territory. Not all of it. Because keep in mind, even before the West officially fell, a lot of that territory had already been lost. I say this a lot, but the fall of the Roman Empire, which is actually the fall of the Western Roman Empire, was far more a process than a singular event. It happened over, decades, essentially. But, I mean, honestly, if you want to look at the large decline, more than decades, 100 years plus, where you had the decline of the central authority of the empire, and slowly, territory on the outskirts in the provinces started to be lost, until, the empire controlled fewer and fewer of their provinces, and they were lost to different groups who came in and conquered them. And even after the official fall of the Western Roman Empire, some of those territories, especially the Italian peninsula, continued to be governed in sort of a similar style, with some of the same institutions in place, and with the Eastern Roman Empire still claiming dominion over the territories. So, not only did people still remember when these territories were under Roman control, kind of, but, nominally, it was all supposed to be under Eastern Roman control. The Eastern Roman Empire still had not given up its claim. It still believed that it was the rightful ruler of all of this lost territory. So, it is incredible that Justinian went about reconquering some of this lost territory, a good chunk of it actually, but it's not like it was something imagined to be impossible, or it was imagined to be pretty difficult. What I should say is it wasn't unimaginable, right? It wasn't like a pipe dream. It was something extremely difficult, but something that wasn't outside the realm of possibility.
It was time to revive that legacy, time to take back what was lost. And to do this, he had to start with North Africa. The North African provinces had always been some of Rome's most stable and prosperous territories.
Yeah.
They had been immune to the turbulence in Europe and the Germanic invasions. They weren't ravaged by constant war or desolated by raids. But in the 430s, Vandal kings had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and marched east, laying siege to Carthage, that ancient enemy Rome had conquered and occupied more than 500 years ago, and taking it as the seat for their new kingdom. But those kings had found more than a capital.
Remember, Carthage was a very wealthy North African empire. And of course, Rome had destroyed a lot of what Carthage once was, but even following that, North Africa was still a relatively prosperous region, especially a couple of the cities in the region. They were making a lot of cash. They were good provinces for Rome to control.
There. In Carthage, they found a navy. The great shipyard of Carthage fell to the Vandals, and with it, much of the Roman fleet. This allowed the Vandals to become pirates, then raiders, then seaborne conquerors. And in time, most of the Mediterranean islands, even Sicily itself, fell to Vandal arms. But most shocking to the Roman world was an event that had happened in the year 455. In 455, the Vandals descended on Rome itself, and sacked it for 14 days. This had led to the last great combined effort of the East and the West, when, in 468, they sent a force of over 100,000 men to retake the North African provinces.
Yeah, there was a time when Rome getting sacked was unbelievable. You go through the stages with Rome, where initially it is this very humble city, in its beginnings, a city, frankly, of miscreants and outcasts. Then it was built up to this, sort of capital of the entire region, extremely powerful. It would have been unimaginable for Rome to be invaded or sacked. And then we go back downwards, and it loses. It still has the legacy and some of the grandeur, but it loses a lot of its importance, a lot of its defenses. And as Rome loses a lot of its territories, it becomes more and more vulnerable to invaders. It does get sacked more than once.
And in one of the worst military disasters of the ancient world, were utterly wiped out. After that, an uneasy peace formed between the Vandals and the Romans. Justinian needed to break this peace if he...
And this is kind of what happened in a lot of the territories. It wasn't... I talk about the empire falling being more of a process than an event. It's not like these territories were all of a sudden taken over and then were completely separate. A lot of times, groups or foreign armies or whomever came in this case the Vandals, took the territory, Rome tried to reclaim them, failed, and then entered into sort of an uneasy agreement where these territories were still nominally part of the Roman Empire. They still professed some sort of explicit loyalty. They might pay some kind of tribute or something like that. But effectively, they were autonomous, and they were not practically under the control of the Roman Empire. This is what happened with a lot of these territories. It wasn't so simple. And then over time, they became more and more autonomous until Rome completely lost control of them. And there wasn't even sort of nominal loyalty to Rome anymore. Of course, part of that process is the Western Empire falling. Part of that is Justinian trying to and achieving taking some of these back. And then, of course, eventually they're lost and the Roman control fades. But it's not like they were all of a sudden just gone.
He was to restore the glory of Rome, if he was to retake what had been taken from them, and avenge the
They were still even if there was no direct political influence, they were still in the Roman sphere of influence. We're talking about territories with Roman citizens, Roman trade routes, Roman infrastructure, Roman politics, Roman culture. I mean, it's all very Roman, you know what I mean? That takes a long time to change all of these things. These are like the bedrock of civilization in a lot of these places. And so even if the Roman Empire no longer has direct political control, they're, like I said, in that Roman sphere of influence. They're in the Roman world, which was, at this point, like the entire Mediterranean and beyond. That would take a while to fade.
Humiliating sack of the Holy City. But even in ancient times, declaring war still required a reason, or a casus belli. The most recent Vandal king had been pro-Orthodox and friendly to Rome, so Justinian bided his time, marshaling his forces and putting his capital back together. But then, in 533, an opportunity came. Gelimer, the cousin of the Vandal king, was afraid that the Vandals, who mostly believed in Arian Christianity, were on their way to becoming subjects of the Orthodox Roman Empire, and rallied a group of like-minded nobles behind him to overthrow the Vandal king. Justinian demanded the legitimate king's restoration. Gelimer flatly refused. Now Justinian had a reason for war. But even as he armed...
It's funny because it's not even like a pagan versus Christian disagreement. It's like an inter-Christian disagreement where the different sects of Christianity just cannot get along with each other, both religiously and politically.
Belisarius with 16,000 men and a fleet 600 ships strong, Justinian himself began to fight a diplomatic war.
And by the way, that's a sizable fleet. That's a sizable force of men to send. The Eastern Roman Empire still has a lot of resources at this point. Justinian is also a real height of the empire. But, the Roman Empire is still not what it once was. It can't marshal those gigantic armies it once could. So this is a pretty sizable force to send. Especially for something like this. It's not like, Rome is defending itself from an incursion. This is an extremely offensive action. These troops are being sent, not like super far, but kind of far afield to go and reconquer territory. So this is a pretty impressive force.
He knew that to win with 16,000 troops where 100,000...
Right, though it's, once again, not what they could once muster.
1,000 men and the combined arms of two empires had failed, he would need to give himself all the advantages he could. He got both Tripolitania, the eastern part of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, and Sardinia to revolt. As luck would have it, Gelimer sent his fleet off to deal with the uprising in Sardinia, clearing the seas for Belisarius' fleet, and allowing them to land in Africa unnoticed. Avoiding naval conflict and establishing a beachhead meant that the Eastern Roman fleet had already achieved the tasks which had given the earlier, larger Roman force the most difficulty. But there was still much of Africa to retake. Belisarius' men started to ravage the countryside looking for food and loot, but Belisarius reined them in, demonstrating the second non-violent part of the Reconquest strategy. He told his men that everything they took was to be paid for. He told his men that they were liberators, not conquerors, and that the populace were to be treated like Romans, because they were Romans, just living under the Vandal yoke.
Right. I talked about this 2 episodes ago, how, Belisarius sort of, when he conquered these territories, ran a bit of a hearts and minds campaign. He wanted to win the loyalty and trust of these people, and he treated them like Roman citizens, because they were, right, nominally, in the eyes of the Eastern Roman Empire. this was all Roman territory. These people were Romans, essentially. And Belisarius, as we saw 2 episodes ago with Dara, he was willing to step out in front and defend Roman citizens, right? That was a big part of his style of warfare, frankly. Now, we saw an exception to that last time with the Nika Revolt, when he was willing, on behalf of his emperor, to step out and essentially order the massacre of tens of thousands of Romans. So we've got some clashing principles here, but, Belisarius was also loyal to his emperor, loyal to the empire, and I think if he believed those people were betraying the empire, going against his emperor, he was willing to do what it took. But in this case, we see, I think, what is more common of Belisarius, which is, not only running a military campaign, but also a sort of political campaign to gain the favor of these people in the territories he's conquering, or, as he would put it, reconquering, taking territories that were rightfully Rome's.
And with that, he won over the local populace. Towns were opened to him. Grain and water were readily sold to his troops. He could start marching northwest up the coast. He would need to cover 150 miles to make it from their land.
And there would be harsh punishment for any of his soldiers who disobeyed his orders, right? I mean, you've got an army of more than 10,000 men. You can't control everybody. There are going to be some soldiers who disobey your rules and loot, or worse. And Belisarius, he would mete out pretty harsh punishment, because he really did want his orders to be obeyed, and for them not to be a, crusading, conquering army, but for them to, like they said, essentially be liberators, though, they wouldn't have used that type of language.
Landing site to Carthage. But by now, word had reached Gelimer of the arrival of the invasion force. Gelimer sent word to his brother to gather their forces and meet him south of the capital. He had a plan. He knew that anyone marching on the capital would have to march through a valley 10 miles east of the city itself. His brother would bring the garrison from the capital and use his smaller force to pin the Byzantines in the valley, where they couldn't bring their numbers to bear, while Gelimer would move his larger force in from where they were stationed in the southeast and attack the Romans from behind.
Classic, get them in a narrow mountain pass and then trap them in.
Belisarius would have been taken totally by surprise, but Gelimer's brother got to the valley just as Belisarius' advanced guard were scouting it, and this elite cavalry guard not only got word back to Belisarius that something was up, but they also smashed the out-of-position Vandals, killing Gelimer's brother. And
that's either sort of good looking out from the cavalry or just a stroke of good luck. I think a combination of both. Clearly some credit should be given to the advanced guard for catching this trap, and then, destroying them, essentially, pushing them back, beating them. But also, this could have gone very badly.
Chasing the remaining troops almost to the walls of Carthage. Gelimer, having no idea that this had happened, charged his forces into the Byzantines from the rear. But since they weren't pinned down by the other Vandal troops in the valley, the Byzantines could wheel around and meet the attack. Despite this, though,
imagine that, pushing into Belisarius, being like, all right, we've got him trapped, only to see him back up, turn around, ready to fight, and you're like, oh no, we're in trouble.
Vandals began to get the better of the day, pushing the Byzantines back. Since they were attacking them from behind, this meant that they were pushing the Byzantines toward Carthage. But as they pushed the Romans through the valley, the same valley where the Roman cavalry had earlier defeated Gelimer's pinning force, Gelimer came upon his brother's men, fallen along the roadside, and the body of his brother shattered and broken upon the ground. And when he saw his brother, he wept. His men came to him for orders, but the only order he would give was that his brother be buried. His men milled about, anxiously waiting for battle commands, but Gelimer just would not respond to the
Yeah, this is a little anecdote that's always told when you hear about this campaign, which is because it actually ends up being quite important. And it's kind of like, probably should have saved the grief for later, ordered your men, you kind of had the momentum going there, but you know what? He's kind of the bad guy in this story. I feel for the man, He clearly loved his brother, that's a sad moment. Now, the sadness could have been saved for later. Would have been better for your, military campaign that was currently going on, but I do empathize.
Situation at hand. Meanwhile, Belisarius, having been pushed through the valley, soon found himself reunited with his elite cavalry force. With these reinforcements, he regrouped and charged the now disorganized Vandal horde. The Vandal army broke and scattered out into the countryside. This force of Vandals that had been one push away from cutting Belisarius off from his cavalry, and perhaps ending the life of one of the greatest generals of late antiquity, that had been one push away from ending Justinian's dreams of a reunited Rome, was now dispersed.
Imagine if Belisarius had been beaten and killed there. Now, Belisarius already, we saw him at Dara, the Nika Revolt. Those are already, two of his great achievements, even if the Nika Revolt, I don't know if I'd call it a military achievement, but he's got so much more left to do. He's got the bulk of his achievements ahead of them, and they will be great achievements. So, counterfactuals, sometimes useful, often not. I don't know if it's incredibly useful here, but you can just briefly imagine how different things might have been if Belisarius had been killed. I really think that, of course, the force behind reconquering these territories was Justinian. It was his ambition at play, but it was Belisarius who put that ambition into practice, who executed his orders. It was his talent and skill, and how he conducted himself that meant that Rome found success in taking back a lot of this territory. I think without him, things would have gone very differently.
A day later, Belisarius marched into Carthage to a people who welcomed him as a liberator and hailed him as a hero. But Gelimer wasn't dead. He had escaped the battle, and so he called his other brother from Sardinia, where he had been putting down the revolt Justinian had helped orchestrate. With the aid of his brother's forces, Gelimer planned another attack on Belisarius. This time, he'd be taking the fight to the walls of Carthage.
Whoa.
Belisarius, fearing treachery from some of his mercenaries, opted to sally out of the city and meet Gelimer on the open field. The fighting was tough. No brilliant tactics, no clever flanking, just direct, grinding, brutal combat. Battle favored the Byzantines, but just barely. The scales of war could tip either way. Then, during a Byzantine charge, Gelimer's other brother was cut down in front of him, and he fled the field. The Vandal forces would never recover from
He was clearly a family-oriented guy. Oh, man, not his other brother. Come on, man.
They held out for a few months in the hills, but by spring, the Vandal kingdom had effectively disappeared. For his service, Justinian awarded Belisarius an honor that hadn't been seen outside the imperial family.
This is a big one.
Since the days of Augustus, 500 years before. A triumph. The greatest honor a Roman general could receive.
It really is. I mean, we've done a lot of Roman history on this channel. We've done, I guess you can cut Roman history into pre and post Julius goddamn Caesar, or pre and post Roman Empire, which started with Caesar's successor, Augustus. But, before the empire, the triumph was a great honor offered to successful generals who had beaten enemy armies, especially generals who had conquered enemy territory. It was this fantastic honor, often given to consuls, political leaders, also military leaders. Of course, Julius Caesar had a couple of triumphs, but, essentially since the Roman Empire had been inaugurated, and the glory that had once been sort of spread out among the generals of the Roman Republic was now concentrated into the figure of the Roman Emperor, who became this sort of deified figure, right? There was, especially these figures after they died, often would literally be deified, prayed to as gods, and even while they were alive, they had a sort of semi-religious character to them. So that, and even just the political system, all the glory and honor was concentrated in them. They didn't want to give triumphs to other people because that would take some of the glory away from them. And, think about it. You have a successful general in the field, you give them a triumph. Emperors were worried that they were essentially building up their rivals, especially in an empire when, it was pretty common for a successful general to be hailed imperator by his men, and then to go back, kill the emperor, and take the throne. The emperors didn't want that to happen. Even those who had earned their position that way, they wanted to stop it. Belisarius is given a triumph. Now, here we start touching on one of the dynamics between Belisarius and Justinian. I believe Belisarius was always loyal, but he was a very popular general who received a lot of glory and adulation from the people, and was even given this honor by Justinian himself. But despite that, and because of that, Justinian over time would become suspicious of Belisarius. He would always make him prove his fealty to the emperor, to him, Justinian, which is fair enough, but those doubts about Belisarius' loyalty would never really go away for Justinian.
Belisarius and his troops marched with the spoils of war and the captives of the campaign through the streets of Byzantium to cheering throngs. But as he and the captive Vandal king stood before the emperor, Gelimer the Vandal lord was heard to say, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." This would be the last triumph Rome was ever to see. But we've not yet reached the apex of Justinian's achievements, nor of Belisarius's. Join us next time as the true reconquest of Rome begins.
We have got more achievements to go. So much has already happened, but we're on episode 4 of a 12-part series. So we've got quite a bit more. I had a good time with this one. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. And with all of that, I hope you guys are all having a good day today. I hope to see you again next time. Goodbye.